Number 1. Fred Neulander. On the evening of November 1st, 1994, officers from the Cherry Hill Police Department responded to an emergency call from a quiet suburban neighborhood in Cherry Hill. The caller claimed he had just returned home and discovered his wife lying unconscious in a pool of blood. At first glance, it appeared to be another tragic homicide. But as detectives examined the scene more closely, something didn't add up. There were no obvious signs of a forced break-in. Valuable belongings remained untouched. And the account given by the husband raised more questions than answers. That husband was Fred Neulander. For years, Neulander had been regarded as one of the most respected religious leaders in southern New Jersey. Born in 1941, he devoted his career to the rabbinate and, in 1974, founded Congregation Makor Shalom. Under his leadership, the congregation grew into one of the largest Reform Jewish communities in the Philadelphia area. To many, he was more than a rabbi. He was a counselor, a trusted advisor, a familiar presence during weddings, funerals, and life's most difficult moments. His wife, Carol Neulander, was equally well known throughout the community. She helped establish a successful bakery business called Classic Cake, and together they appeared to represent the image of a close-knit and respected family. Few could have imagined that behind this carefully maintained reputation, investigators would eventually uncover allegations of betrayal, deception, and murder. According to Neulander's statement, he had returned home after an evening at the synagogue and found Carol collapsed inside the living room. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the 52-year-old was pronounced dead at the scene. Medical examiners determined she had died from severe blunt force injuries, indicating a deliberate and violent assault. Yet detectives struggled to identify any reason an intruder would have entered the house. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The home showed little evidence of a robbery gone wrong. As investigators dug deeper into Neulander's personal life, another story began to emerge. Witnesses revealed that he had been involved in a long-term relationship with Elaine Sonsini, a radio personality from the Philadelphia area. According to testimony presented years later, the relationship had lasted for roughly 2 years before Carol's death. Prosecutors would eventually argue that Neulander wanted to continue that relationship without the complications of divorce, and that eliminating his wife had become part of his plan. For several years, however, investigators lacked the evidence needed to prove it. The case remained largely circumstantial. Everything changed in 2000. A man named Len Genoff came forward with a confession that transformed the investigation. Genoff, who knew Neulander through an Alcoholics Anonymous program connected to the synagogue, admitted his involvement in Carol Neulander's killing. According to his account, Neulander had approached him repeatedly over several months, asking him to arrange the murder. Genoff told investigators he recruited another man, Paul Michael Daniels, and that both were promised payment totaling $30,000 for carrying out the attack. Authorities compared Genoff's statement with the physical evidence collected years earlier. Investigators concluded that Carol's injuries were consistent with being struck repeatedly by a heavy metal object, believed to be a lead pipe, although the alleged weapon was never recovered. Both Genoff and Daniels later pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against Neulander as part of plea agreements. Armed with new testimony, prosecutors charged Fred Neulander with murder, felony murder, and conspiracy. His first trial began in 2001, but ended without a verdict after jurors failed to reach unanimous agreement. Because of the intense media attention surrounding the case, the retrial was moved to another county. During the second trial, jurors heard testimony from both admitted participants, along with Elaine Sonsini, who described conversations she claimed Neulander had before Carol's death. The prosecution argued that the affair, combined with the murder-for-hire arrangement, established both motive and intent. The defense challenged the credibility of the cooperating witnesses, arguing they had strong incentives to shift blame in exchange for reduced sentences. Even so, the prosecution's case proved persuasive. Adding emotional weight to the proceedings, 2 of Neulander's own children testified for the prosecution. On November 20th, 2002, the jury found Fred Neulander guilty on all major charges. He was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Over the following years, Neulander pursued multiple appeals, arguing that legal errors had affected his conviction. Each attempt ultimately failed, leaving the verdict intact. He remained incarcerated until April 17, 2024, when prison officials found him unresponsive inside the infirmary at a correctional facility in Trenton. He was 82 years old. The man who had once stood before hundreds as a spiritual leader spent the final chapter of his life behind prison walls. A case that began with a desperate 911 call, ended with the courts concluding that the husband, seeking help, had, years earlier, arranged the very crime he claimed to have discovered. Number 2. Dana Thompson. Sometimes the biggest breakthrough in a murder investigation doesn't come from a new witness or a confession. It comes years later, when investigators decide to reopen a case everyone else believed was over. That was exactly what happened in England, where a body buried for 7 years would reveal the truth behind a death once thought impossible to explain. The woman at the center of that mystery was Dina Thompson. Born in 1960, Thompson spent much of her adult life moving through southern England, building new relationships while leaving behind a trail of deception. Friends and acquaintances often described her as charming and persuasive, someone who could easily adapt her personality depending on who she was speaking to. She frequently met men through newspaper personal advertisements, introducing herself as someone searching for companionship. But according to investigators, many of those relationships eventually followed the same pattern. Money disappeared, stories changed, and sympathy became a tool. Authorities later uncovered years of alleged financial fraud involving forged signatures, false medical claims, and debts accumulated under the names of people close to her. Throughout much of that period, she also remained legally married to her first husband, despite beginning relationships with other men. One of those men was Julian Webb. Webb worked as an advertising manager and met Thompson through a personal advertisement. Their relationship developed quickly, and in 1991 they went through a marriage ceremony. Years later, prosecutors revealed that the marriage itself had been invalid because Thompson had never legally ended her previous marriage. Still, the couple built a life together in Yapton. According to the prosecution, Thompson soon convinced Webb that she had been diagnosed with cancer and urgently needed financial help to pay for treatment. Believing her story, Webb handed over approximately £25,000 in savings. Then, on June 30th, 1994, his 31st birthday, everything changed. Webb suddenly became seriously ill inside the couple's home. His mother called that day hoping to speak with her son, but Thompson reportedly told her he was too sick to answer the phone. Concerned, Webb's mother urged her to contact a doctor. According to prosecutors, that never happened. By the following day, Julian Webb was dead. The circumstances surrounding his death puzzled investigators, but there wasn't enough evidence to determine exactly what had happened. A coroner returned an open verdict, leaving the cause unresolved. Then another detail caught investigators' attention years later. Less than 24 hours after Webb's death, Thompson reportedly visited his workplace to ask how soon his death-in-service benefits would be paid. The policy was worth around £36,000. She also sought permission to have Webb cremated. That request was never approved. At the time, however, the case slowly faded from public attention. For 6 years, Julian Webb's death remained an unanswered mystery. Then, an entirely different criminal case unexpectedly brought everything back into focus. In 2000, Thompson stood trial over allegations involving her third husband, Richard Thompson. She was acquitted. For Julian Webb's family, The conviction finally answered questions they had lived with for nearly a decade. Yet the case also serves as a reminder of how close justice came to slipping away. Had another investigation never prompted detectives to revisit Webb's death, had his body been cremated as originally requested, the evidence that ultimately secured the conviction may never have existed. Sometimes justice depends not only on evidence, but on one overlooked detail that refuses to stay buried. Number 3. Perry March. Sometimes, the first clue in a murder investigation isn't a fingerprint or a weapon. It's the amount of time someone waits before asking for help. For detectives in Nashville, that delay would become the first warning sign in a case that would take nearly a decade to solve. On August 29, 1996, Perry March and his father-in-law, Lawrence Levine, walked into a police precinct to report that Perry's wife, Janet March, had disappeared. But there was one problem. Janet hadn't been seen for nearly 2 weeks. Experienced investigators immediately questioned why a missing mother of 2 hadn't been reported sooner. That unusual delay marked the beginning of one of Tennessee's longest-running homicide investigations. Before suspicion fell on him, Perry March appeared to have built a successful life. He attended the University of Michigan, where he met Janet Levine. Afterward, he enrolled at Vanderbilt Law School, with much of his education financially supported by Janet's family. Her father, Lawrence Levine, was a respected attorney who eventually hired Perry into his law practice. The Levines even helped the couple build a custom home in the upscale Forest Hills area of Nashville. From the outside, Perry seemed to have everything: a successful legal career, a respected family, a comfortable lifestyle. But beneath that polished image, prosecutors would later allege that serious problems had already begun to surface. Investigators eventually uncovered evidence suggesting Perry had been secretly embezzling money from his father-in-law's law firm. They also learned he had been involved in an undisclosed affair with one of the firm's paralegals. Meanwhile, Janet's marriage was reportedly falling apart. According to evidence presented in court, she had arranged to meet with a divorce attorney on August 16, 1996. She never made that appointment. The last time anyone is believed to have seen Janet alive was the evening before. When Perry finally reported her missing, he claimed she had packed her belongings after an argument and voluntarily left for what he described as a 12-day vacation. Detectives quickly began checking that story. No confirmed sightings, no phone calls, no credit card activity, no financial transactions. Nothing suggested Janet had willingly started a new life. Then investigators found her vehicle abandoned at a nearby apartment complex. Inside were many of her personal belongings, including her passport. For detectives, that discovery made Perry's explanation even harder to believe. Attention soon shifted to the family home. At the time Janet disappeared, renovation work was underway on the property. One contractor later testified that the ongoing construction could have made it relatively easy to conceal evidence without attracting attention. Cadaver dogs were eventually brought to the residence. They alerted investigators to areas of interest on the property, adding to growing suspicions. Even so, prosecutors still lacked enough evidence to bring homicide charges. The investigation continued for years. In 1999, Perry relocated with the couple's 2 children to Ajajik following a lengthy custody dispute involving Janet's parents. But detectives in Nashville never stopped building their case. By 2004, a grand jury concluded there was enough evidence to indict Perry March on charges including second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, evidence tampering, and theft connected to the money allegedly taken from the Levine law firm. He was extradited from Mexico the following year. While awaiting trial in jail, investigators employed an unusual strategy. They placed a confidential informant near Perry and secretly recorded their conversations. According to prosecutors, those recordings captured incriminating statements about Janet's disappearance. Authorities also obtained recordings in which Perry allegedly discussed arranging the murders of Janet's parents. Then came perhaps the most devastating testimony of the entire trial. Perry's own father, Arthur March, entered into a plea agreement and told jurors that he had helped his son move and dispose of Janet's body after her death on the night of August 15, 1996. Although Janet's remains were never recovered, prosecutors argued the combination of witness testimony, recorded conversations, forensic evidence, and Perry's own actions painted a compelling picture of guilt. The defense disagreed. Attorneys attacked the credibility of cooperating witnesses, argued there was no direct physical evidence linking Perry to Janet's death, and maintained she had chosen to leave voluntarily. Ultimately, the jury wasn't persuaded. On August 17, 2006, almost exactly 10 years after Janet was last seen alive, jurors returned guilty verdicts on every major charge. The court imposed multiple consecutive sentences, totaling 56 years in prison for murder, conspiracy, theft, and related offenses. Today, Perry March remains incarcerated within the Tennessee Department of Correction. His appeals in both state and federal courts have been unsuccessful, and despite years of investigation, one heartbreaking mystery remains unsolved. Janet March's body has never been found, a disappearance that began with a delayed missing person report, ended with a conviction. But without the one piece of evidence her family has spent decades hoping to recover. Number 4. Cherie Miller. Sometimes a murder investigation is solved by DNA. Sometimes it's solved by fingerprints. And sometimes, the key evidence is sitting untouched inside a briefcase hundreds of miles away. That unlikely discovery would unravel one of the earliest murder conspiracies built almost entirely through the internet. A case that forever changed how digital conversations could be used inside a courtroom. The central figure was Cherie Miller. Born in 1971, Miller lived in the Flint area of Michigan. She worked as a bookkeeper at an auto salvage business owned by Bruce Miller, a hard-working businessman who had spent years building his company. Their relationship eventually turned romantic, and in April 1999, the couple married during a ceremony in Las Vegas. Friends described Bruce as quiet, dependable, and focused on work. Cherie, however, lived much of her social life online. Long before social media became part of everyday life, she spent countless hours inside AOL chat rooms, communicating with multiple men across the country. According to investigators, those online relationships would ultimately become central to the case. Everything changed on November 8, 1999. Bruce Miller was found dead inside the office of his salvage yard in Mount Morris Township after suffering a fatal shotgun wound. Family members discovered his body and immediately contacted emergency services. Detectives began searching for suspects. Their attention initially focused on a former employee who had recently borrowed money from Bruce before disappearing under suspicious circumstances. For months, investigators pursued that lead, but the investigation stalled. Then, hundreds of miles away in Odessa, another tragedy unexpectedly changed everything. Former police officer Jerry Cassidy died by suicide. As his family sorted through his belongings, they discovered a locked briefcase. Inside were hundreds of pages of printed emails, online chat conversations, handwritten notes, and a personal confession. When investigators reviewed the contents, the direction of the entire murder investigation shifted overnight. The documents revealed that Cassidy had developed a lengthy online relationship with Cherie Miller. According to prosecutors, she had spent months convincing him that her husband was dangerous. She allegedly claimed Bruce was abusive, connected to organized crime, and posed a serious threat to her safety. Investigators also alleged she falsely told Cassidy she was carrying his child, even using ultrasound images from previous pregnancies to support the story. As the relationship intensified, the communications became increasingly disturbing. Records suggested Shari eventually met Cassidy in person at a highway rest stop, where prosecutors said she provided him with a cell phone and instructions before he traveled to Michigan. Armed with the evidence recovered from the briefcase, investigators confronted Shari. She was arrested in February 2000, but prosecutors soon faced an entirely new challenge. At the time, American courts had little experience handling internet conversations as major evidence in a homicide case. Defense attorneys argued that chat logs, emails, and Cassidy's written statements should not be admitted because many of them had been created outside the courtroom. The legal battle became one of the earliest high-profile cases, testing how digital communications could be used to prove criminal conspiracy. When the trial began in late 2000, prosecutors argued that Shari had carefully manipulated Cassidy's emotions, convincing him that killing Bruce was the only way they could be together. They described a campaign of deception that exploited his emotional vulnerability and gradually persuaded him to commit murder on her behalf. The defense rejected that theory. Attorneys argued Cassidy acted independently and insisted the online conversations failed to prove that Shari had legally conspired in the killing. After hearing the evidence, jurors reached a different conclusion. Following 2 days of deliberations, they found Shari Miller guilty. In January 2001, she received a life sentence for conspiracy, along with an additional sentence for second-degree murder. Years later, in 2016, Miller wrote a letter acknowledging her role in planning her husband's death, providing yet another chapter in a case that had already reshaped the legal treatment of electronic evidence. Today, Shari Miller remains incarcerated at Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility. What makes the investigation especially remarkable is how close it came to remaining unsolved. For months, detectives pursued an entirely different suspect. Unaware that the evidence capable of exposing the conspiracy was sitting inside a briefcase, in another state, waiting to be discovered. Number 5. David Mark Temple. Sometimes, the smallest detail at a crime scene raises the biggest questions. Not a fingerprint, not a weapon, but a family dog. When deputies arrived at a home in Katy on January 11th, 1999, they expected to investigate what appeared to be a violent home invasion. Instead, one unusual observation immediately caught investigators' attention. The family's chow dog had been locked inside the garage. For detectives, that detail didn't fit the story they were hearing. If a stranger had broken into the home, why would the dog already be secured out of the way? That single inconsistency became one of many questions surrounding the death of Belinda Temple. Her husband, David Mark Temple, was well known throughout the Katy community. A former football standout at Katy High School, Temple had earned a reputation as a talented linebacker before continuing his athletic career at Stephen F. Austin State University. It was there he met Belinda Lucas, another student athlete. The two eventually married, returned to the Houston area, and built what appeared to be a stable family life. David became an assistant football coach at Alief Hastings High School. Belinda worked as a special education teacher. Together, they were raising their young son, Evan, while eagerly awaiting the birth of their second child. To neighbors and friends, they seemed like an ordinary family with promising futures. But on that January afternoon in 1999, everything changed. Belinda, who was 8 months pregnant, was found fatally shot inside the family home. David told investigators he had returned from running errands, noticed shattered glass near the back door, taken his young son across the street for safety, and then gone back inside where he discovered his wife. Initially, the scene appeared consistent with a burglary gone wrong, but as crime scene specialists examined the evidence, they noticed several details that didn't support a forced entry theory. The pattern of broken glass suggested the door may have been open when it shattered, rather than being broken from the outside. The family dog had been confined before the attack, and despite extensive investigation, No intruder was ever identified. As detectives reconstructed David Temple's movements that afternoon, prosecutors later argued his timeline contained a brief window during which he could have returned to the house unnoticed. Another development soon added to investigators' suspicions. Just days before Belinda's death, Temple reportedly told fellow teacher Heather Scott that he was falling in love with her. Scott later provided investigators with a signed statement describing that conversation. Even with growing suspicions, authorities lacked enough evidence to make an immediate arrest. Years passed. Then, in 2004, prosecutors announced that additional forensic testing, including gunshot residue analysis conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation Laboratory, had strengthened their case. David Temple was arrested. His first trial began in 2007 and attracted widespread attention across Texas. The courtroom featured a legal battle between prosecutor Kelly Siegler and defense attorney Dick DeGuerin, two of the state's most recognizable trial lawyers. During proceedings, the defense successfully challenged key forensic evidence after raising concerns about the FBI laboratory's ventilation system and the reliability of the gunshot residue findings. They also suggested that another individual, a teenage neighbor, should be considered an alternate suspect. Despite those challenges, the jury found David Temple guilty of murder. He received a life sentence. But the legal battle wasn't over. Nearly a decade later, an appellate court determined prosecutors had failed to disclose evidence favorable to the defense during the original trial. The conviction was overturned. Temple was released while awaiting a new trial. In 2019, prosecutors presented the case to a second jury. Once again, jurors found him guilty. Although the sentencing phase initially ended without unanimous agreement, a separate sentencing hearing was later held. In 2023, another jury imposed a life sentence along with a financial penalty. Under Texas law applicable to offenses committed at that time, Temple may eventually become eligible for parole only after serving a substantial portion of his sentence. The case carried another heartbreaking reality. Belinda had been only weeks away from giving birth. The couple had already chosen a name for their unborn daughter, Erin Ashley. Because of the laws in effect in 1999, prosecutors could pursue charges only for Belinda's death. They later noted that changes in Texas law have since expanded legal protections in similar cases involving unborn victims. In another twist that drew public attention, Heather Scott, the woman Temple later married less than 2 years after Belinda's death, filed for divorce while his second murder trial was underway. Today, David Mark Temple remains incarcerated after 2 separate juries reached the same conclusion. What first appeared to be a random home invasion gradually unraveled into a case built on forensic inconsistencies, a suspicious timeline, and one small detail investigators never ignored: the family dog waiting quietly inside the garage,